Picture this: September 1943. A Japanese ace pilot picks up an intelligence report about America's new fighter plane. He reads the specs and bursts out laughing. The Americans built a fighter that weighs twice as much as our Zero. It's as heavy as a bomber. This thing is so overbuilt, it can barely fly. He shows it to the other pilots in the tent. They're all laughing too. Another American failure, they say. Another clumsy design from people who don't understand aerial combat. Here's what makes this crazy. In exactly 30 days, this so-called failure would begin the systematic destruction of Japanese naval aviation. Within 6 months, those same pilots who were laughing, they'd be writing final letters home, knowing that encountering this aircraft meant almost certain death. The fighter they mocked would achieve a kill ratio of 19-1. It would shoot down over 5,000 Japanese aircraft while losing only 270 in air-to-air combat. And the wildest part? Everything the Japanese pilots believed about fighter design, everything that made them laugh at this plane, was exactly what made it the deadliest weapon in the Pacific. Stay with me here, because this story gets absolutely insane. The Japanese Navy's confidence in September 1943 wasn't just swagger. It was backed by cold, hard numbers. Since Pearl Harbor, their pilots had achieved victory ratios that seemed almost impossible. At Pearl Harbor itself, they lost 29 aircraft while destroying 347 American planes. In the Philippines, 7 losses against 103 destroyed. Over Darwin, Australia, 2 losses versus 30 kills. The British Far East Fleet's air arm? Completely annihilated. The Dutch East Indies Air Force? Eliminated in a matter of days. At the heart of this domination flew the Mitsubishi A6M-Zero, an aircraft that had literally rewritten the rules of what a fighter plane could be. When American engineers finally got their hands on a captured Zero in 1942 and tested it, they initially refused to believe the performance numbers. This thing had the range of a bomber, the maneuverability of a World War I biplane, and the firepower to shred anything it caught. It seemed physically impossible. Think about that for a second. A fighter that could fly further than most bombers, turn tighter than anything in the sky, and had already proven itself in combat against every Allied fighter it had faced. British Hurricanes, American P-40 Warhawks, Dutch Brewster Buffaloes. All of them had fallen before the Zero's guns. Warrant Officer Hiroyoshi Nishizawa, who would become Japan's highest-scoring ace with 87 confirmed kills, described flying the Zero in his diary. He wrote that flying the Zero was like wearing wings. The aircraft responded to thought, not just control inputs. American planes, he said, flew like trucks. Powerful but clumsy. They build fighters like they build cars, he wrote. Heavy, overbuilt, wasteful. And here's the thing. He wasn't wrong about American design philosophy. The Zero achieved its miraculous performance through a revolutionary approach. Japanese engineers used a classified aluminum alloy called extra superduralumin that created a structure 30% lighter than comparable American designs. But they went further. No armor plate to protect the pilot, no self-sealing fuel tanks that would add weight. They even removed the radio to save 30 pounds. Every single ounce was sacrificed for performance. The Zero was a flying scalpel, precision engineered for one purpose: aerial supremacy through superior maneuverability. So when the first intelligence reports about the F6F Hellcat reached Japanese headquarters in early 1943, their reaction made perfect sense. The specifications looked like propaganda. Actually, Japanese intelligence officers wondered if it was deliberate misinformation meant to confuse them. The aircraft weighed 12,186 pounds fully loaded. The Zero weighed 5,800 pounds. Let that sink in. The Hellcat was more than twice as heavy. Its wing area spanned 334 square feet with what the Japanese considered a draggy radial engine stuck on the front. It carried 2,400 rounds of ammunition, armor plate everywhere, bulletproof glass, self-sealing fuel tanks holding 250 gallons. Captain Minoru Genda, the tactical genius who had planned the Pearl Harbor attack, reviewed these specifications at Combined Fleet Headquarters. His analysis, which was preserved in Japanese defense archives, was completely dismissive. "The Americans have learned nothing," he wrote. "This Hellcat represents the continuation of their failed philosophy. They're trying to overcome pilot skill with weight of machinery. A Zero will fly circles around it. And look, the math seemed to back him up completely. The Zero's wing loading of 22 pounds per square foot gave it a turning radius of 612 feet. The Hellcat's wing loading of 36.5 pounds per square foot suggested a turning radius over 900 feet. In a turning fight, which was the absolute foundation of all Japanese fighter tactics, the Hellcat would be helpless. It would be like bringing a freight train to a knife fight. But here's where everything changes. September 30th, 1943, Marcus Island in the Pacific. Petty Officer First Class Yoshio Fukui was flying escort for a reconnaissance mission when he spotted them. 6 dark blue shapes climbing from the southeast. His first thought, which he recorded in his after-action report, was that they were B-25 bombers on a strange heading. Then they turned, and he saw the distinctive silhouette. Single engine, massive fuselage, wings that seemed too short for the body. First encounter with F6F type fighter, he would write. Initial impression: Americans have mounted fighter guns on a torpedo bomber. So he engaged with what he called standard tactics. Standard tactics meant using the Zero's superior turn rate to get on the enemy's tail. Fukui rolled into a diving turn, expecting the heavy American fighter to continue straight, allowing him to curve onto its 6 o'clock position and light it up. Instead, something unprecedented happened. The Hellcat didn't run. It didn't try to turn with him. It went straight up. Vertical. The Pratt & Whitney R2800 double wasp engine, producing 2,000 horsepower, 700 more than the Zero's Nakajima Sakai engine, drove the Hellcat upward at 3,500 feet per minute. Fukui tried to follow, but he watched his airspeed just bleed away as the Zero struggled against gravity. At 15,000 feet, the Hellcat performed a maneuver that shouldn't have been possible for an aircraft that heavy. A hammerhead turn that dropped it directly onto Fukui's tail. The American opened fire at 400 meters, Fukui reported. 6 machine guns, not the 4 we expected. The volume of fire was unprecedented. My aircraft took 17 hits in 3 seconds. Only by dropping into a spin did I escape. Fukui survived, barely making it back to Marcus Island with his Zero, looking like Swiss cheese. His wingman, Petty Officer Second Class Masao, didn't return. Neither did the reconnaissance plane they were supposed to be escorting. First blood to the Hellcat. Here's what the Japanese pilots were just beginning to discover. The weight they had laughed at? That wasn't a weakness. It was a weapon. October 5th, 1943. Task Force 14 struck Wake Island. Lieutenant Yoshio Shiga led 12 Zeros from the 252nd Air Group to intercept what appeared to be another nuisance raid. American carriers had been launching these hit-and-run attacks for months, usually fleeing before Japanese fighters could fully engage. The Japanese pilots figured this time would be different. They had the advantage. We climbed to 20,000 feet, Shiga recorded in his diary. Below us, 12 F6F fighters in 3 divisions. We held every advantage. Altitude, position, surprise. Victory was certain. What happened next shattered everything Japanese pilots thought they knew about air combat. As the Zeros dove on the Hellcats, the American fighters didn't scatter. They didn't try to turn. They maintained formation, accelerating in a gentle dive that kept their energy high. When the Zeros opened fire at maximum range, hoping for lucky hits, the Hellcats simply absorbed the punishment. And this is where that weight becomes terrifying. The Hellcat's armor included 212 pounds of plate protecting the pilot, 110 pounds around the oil system. Those self-sealing fuel tanks could take dozens of hits and keep flying. The Zeros exhausted their ammunition in diving passes, and the Hellcats were still flying, still fighting, still coming. Then the Hellcats executed their counterattack. Instead of turning to dogfight, they used their weight as a weapon. They climbed at full power, reaching altitudes where the Zero's engine was gasping for oxygen. At 25,000 feet, the Hellcat was still producing 1,650 horsepower. The Zero was down to 900. They came down on us like hawks on sparrows, Shiga wrote. Their weight gave them speed we couldn't match. They would dive, fire those 6 terrible guns, then climb away before we could react. If we tried to follow them up, we stalled out. If we tried to turn with them, they just refused to turn and climbed away. We had no answer. 8 Zeros were shot down that day. Not a single Hellcat was lost. By November 1943, the few Japanese pilots who had survived multiple encounters with Hellcats were trying desperately to teach the others what they'd learned. Lieutenant Commander Tao Tanamizu, with 32 victories, briefed the assembled pilots of the 204th Air Group at Rabaul. "Forget everything you know about air combat," he told them. "The Americans have changed the rules. They no longer fight our fight. They fight like executioners, not warriors." Tanamizu explained what Japanese pilots were slowly, fatally learning. The Hellcat wasn't designed to outturn the Zero. It was designed to never need to. American pilots were using something called energy fighting. They maintained speed and altitude, converting potential energy to kinetic energy in slashing attacks. That gave Zero pilots no chance to use their superior maneuverability. "They work in pairs," Tanamizu continued. "One high, one low. While you engage one, the other is already diving on you. Their radios, which we laughed at for adding weight, let them coordinate perfectly. We fly as individual samurai. They fight as a machine." Think about what he's saying there. The Japanese had trained their pilots to be artists of aerial combat, individual warriors perfecting their craft. The Americans had built a system, and the system was grinding the artists into dust. The technology gap was becoming a chasm. The Hellcat 6 Browning M2 machine guns fired 750 rounds per minute each. That's 4,500 rounds per minute total. Each 50 caliber bullet weighed 46 grams and traveled at 2,900 feet per second, delivering 3,500 foot-pounds of energy. The Zero's 2 7.7-meter machine guns fired projectiles weighing 11 grams at 2,300 feet per second. 750 foot-pounds of energy. It wasn't even close. But even more disturbing to Japanese pilots were the reports of radar-guided fighter direction. While Japanese pilots still relied on their eyesight to spot enemies, Hellcat pilots were being guided to their targets by shipboard radar controllers who could see Japanese aircraft from 50 miles away. Lieutenant Sadamu Kamachi described his first radar-directed interception. "We were climbing through clouds when they hit us," he wrote. "No warning, no visual contact. Hellcats diving from above, exactly on our heading, perfectly positioned. They knew where we were, our altitude, our course. We were blind men fighting those who could see in the dark." And then there was the pilot equation, which was becoming absolutely catastrophic for Japan. The pre-war Imperial Navy pilot training program had been the world's most demanding. Training took 3 years, with pilots entering combat with 700 flight hours. They were artists of aerial combat, trained in aerobatics, gunnery, and even the spiritual philosophy of air fighting. By early 1944, Japanese naval pilots were entering combat with 300 hours of flight time. Army pilots had 200 hours. Fuel shortages meant most training was done in gliders. Gunnery practice was limited to 50 rounds per pilot. 50 rounds. Meanwhile, American pilots were arriving with 300 hours minimum, including 50 hours in the actual Hellcat. They had fired thousands of practice rounds. They'd practiced carrier landings until they were automatic. Lieutenant Commander Yoshihiro Hashimoto, training officer at Kasumigara Naval Air Station, wrote in his final report, "We are sending children to fight professionals. Yesterday, Ensign Yamamoto arrived at the front. He had never fired his guns in flight. We have no ammunition for practice. He had never flown at night. We have no fuel for such training." He lasted 7 minutes in his first combat. 7 minutes. That's how long a Japanese pilot with inadequate training lasted against American Hellcat pilots who had been properly prepared for combat. The Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944 would prove just how completely the balance of power had shifted. The Japanese Navy committed its reconstituted carrier force to what they called Operation Ago, the decisive battle that would destroy American carrier power in the Pacific. 9 carriers, 450 aircraft, their best remaining pilots. Against them, Task Force 58 with 15 carriers and 956 aircraft. 450 of them were F6F Hellcats. Admiral Saburo launched his strikes in 4 waves, confident that Japanese pilot skill and the Zero's range advantage would prevail. The first wave of 69 aircraft launched at 8:30 in the morning. American radar detected them at 150 miles. Hellcats were vectored for interception with perfect positioning. Altitude advantage. Sun at their backs, approaching from the Japanese blind spots. Lieutenant Zenji Abe, leading the fighter escort, saw the Hellcats minutes before engagement. They were stacked from 20,000 to 30,000 feet, he reported. At least 60 of them waiting like a steel curtain. We were at 18,000 feet. Every advantage was theirs. The engagement lasted 12 minutes. Of 69 Japanese aircraft, 42 were shot down. Commander David McCampbell, commanding Air Group 15, shot down 7 aircraft in that single day. His wingman, Lieutenant Roy Rushing, got 6. The Zeros tried to turn with us, McCampbell reported. We simply refused. We'd make a high side run, shoot one down, zoom climb back to altitude. They'd try to follow, stall out, and another Hellcat would pick them off. By day's end, the Japanese had lost 346 carrier aircraft plus 50 land-based aircraft. American losses? 30 aircraft from all causes. American pilots in their ready rooms that evening coined a term for what had just happened. They called it the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. The enemy aircraft had been as helpless as game birds. Let me put this in perspective. The Japanese had launched 400 aircraft in waves throughout the day. They lost nearly 400 of them. The Americans lost 30. That's not a battle. That's an execution. Commander David McCampbell would set his single mission record during the Battle of Leyte Gulf in October 1944. Leading 7 Hellcats from USS Essex, he intercepted a force of 60 Japanese aircraft heading for the American fleet. In the 90-minute battle that followed, McCampbell shot down 9 aircraft, 5 Zeros and 4 bombers. His wingman, Roy Rushing, destroyed 6 more. I ran out of ammunition after the 9th kill, McCampbell recorded. The Hellcat performed flawlessly throughout. Not a single hit on my aircraft despite being outnumbered 8-1. Read that again. 7 Hellcats had routed 60 Japanese aircraft, destroying 15 without loss. This engagement demonstrated the complete reversal of air superiority. The hunter had become the hunted. The psychological impact of the Hellcat on surviving Japanese pilots was devastating. Japanese military psychologists later termed it Hellcat psychosis. Admiral Ozawa, in his after-action report, wrote something that really captures the horror of what they were facing. The enemy's radar-guided fighter direction achieved something we thought impossible, he wrote, the industrialization of air combat. Each Hellcat was not an individual fighter, but a component in a vast machine. Our pilots, no matter how skilled, were engaging not planes, but a system. The pilot shortage became so acute that by early 1945, training was reduced to 40 to 50 hours for Navy pilots, 60 to 70 hours for Army pilots. Kamikaze pilots received only 40 to 50 hours total. Approximately 7 days of training before they were expected to fly their aircraft into American ships. The transformation of Japanese naval aviation from an elite force to kamikaze operations represented the ultimate admission of Hellcat superiority. Unable to compete conventionally, Japan turned its pilots into guided missiles. Vice Admiral Takejiro Onishi, father of the kamikaze program, justified it with stark mathematics. If a Zero attacks a carrier conventionally, he said, probability of success is near zero. The Hellcats will destroy it. If the Zero becomes a bomb, probability of hitting increases to 30%. The pilot dies either way. At least as a kamikaze, his death has meaning. On October 25, 1944, Hiroyoshi Nishizawa, Japan's ace of aces, escorted the first official kamikaze mission. He claimed his 86th and 87th victories that day, 2 F6F Hellcats. The next day, October 26, 1944, Nishizawa died as a passenger aboard a transport that was shot down by Hellcats from Fighter Squadron 14. Japan's greatest ace, helpless without a fighter, fell to the very aircraft he had briefly bested. The Battle of Okinawa from April to June 1945 would be the final demonstration of Hellcat dominance. The Japanese launched 1,900 kamikaze sorties against the American fleet. Lieutenant Eugene Valencia, leading his Flying Circus division of Hellcats, shot down 23 Japanese aircraft during the campaign. His tactical innovations made traditional Japanese tactics suicidal. We developed what we called the mowing machine, Valencia explained. 4 Hellcats in line, abreast, separated by 100 yards, would sweep through Japanese formations at high speed. Each pilot covered his sector. We'd make one pass, climb back to altitude, and repeat. The mathematics of the Okinawa campaign tell the story. Hellcats flew 38,038 combat sorties. They claimed 2,351 victories against 249 losses, a 9.5 to 1 ratio. More significantly, they prevented approximately 80% of kamikaze aircraft from reaching their targets. By 1945, the F6F5 Hellcat had incorporated improvements that made it even deadlier. Water injection boosting power to 2,200 horsepower, zero-length rocket launchers, improved armor, the K-14 computing gun sight that calculated deflection automatically. Lieutenant Commander Saburo Sakai, Japan's legendary ace, encountered Hellcats for the first time in June 1944. Despite his skill and experience, he was nearly killed in his first engagement. I performed my best aerobatics, he wrote in his autobiography. Loops, rolls, splits, every maneuver I had perfected over 200 combats. The Hellcat followed easily, almost casually. I survived only because the American pilot made an error. He forgot to release his drop tank before combat. Think about what Sakai is saying. He threw everything he had at this Hellcat pilot. Every trick he'd learned in 200 combats. And the Hellcat just followed him through all of it. The only reason Sakai survived was because the American pilot had extra drag from a drop tank he forgot to release. By the end of the war, the numbers told a story of absolute dominance. The F6F Hellcat had destroyed 5,223 enemy aircraft in aerial combat. It had lost 270 aircraft to enemy fighters. That's a kill ratio of 19.3 to 1. It produced 305 U.S. Navy aces. It accounted for 75% of all Navy air-to-air victories. The human cost for Japan was catastrophic. Of the 18,000 naval aviators who had started the war, fewer than 100 combat-experienced pilots remained by August 1945. When the war ended on August 15, 1945, Captain Minoru Genda, the man who had dismissed the Hellcat as weight over finesse, listened to Emperor Hirohito's surrender broadcast at Atsugi Airfield. Around him sat the remnants of Japanese naval aviation. Teenage pilots with 40 hours of a flight time, aircraft cobbled together from spare parts, empty fuel tanks. That same day, Ensign Clarence Moore of Fighter Squadron 31, flying from USS Belleau Wood, shot down a Yokosuka D-4Y Judy dive bomber after 2 in the afternoon, the last aerial victory of World War II. The Japanese pilot, apparently unaware of the surrender, was approaching the American fleet when Moore intercepted him. 2 short bursts from the Hellcat's 6 guns ended the Pacific Air War. In September 1945, the first American aircraft to land at Atsugi Airfield after the surrender were 12 F6F Hellcats from USS Yorktown. Japanese pilots, mechanics, and ground crew lined the runway to see their tormentor up close for the first time. American pilot Lieutenant Robert Voziu, an ace with 19 victories, demonstrated the Hellcat's capabilities to Japanese pilots. His casual aerobatics, loops, rolls, and climbs that would have torn a Zero apart left them speechless. "You have to understand," Voziu told them through an interpreter, "this isn't even pushing it. In combat with water injection, it's 20% more powerful. The plane is stressed for 13 Gs. I've never managed to break one." Japanese engineers studying captured Hellcats after the war discovered the true extent of American industrial superiority. The Pratt & Whitney R2800 engine contained 2,840 precision machine parts, each one interchangeable with any other R2800 engine. You could pull an engine off one Hellcat and bolt it onto another, and it would work perfectly. The Nakajima Sakai engine required hand-fitting of components. No 2 engines were exactly alike. Professor Jiro Horikoshi, designer of the Zero, studied the Hellcat extensively after the war. His conclusion was devastating. "We designed an aircraft for 1941, he wrote. They designed an aircraft system for 1945. While we were perfecting the sword, they were building the industrial age." And here's something that the Japanese found almost impossible to comprehend. Grumman's production of the Hellcat itself became a weapon. The Bethpage, New York factory operated 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. At peak production, a new Hellcat rolled off the assembly line every 60 minutes. Every single hour. The company produced 12,275 Hellcats in 30 months. In 1944, alone, Japan produced 5,100 fighters of all types. America produced 35,000 fighters that year. Just that one year. The production system included innovations that seemed impossible to Japanese observers. Workers using color-coded instructions to assemble complex components. Shifts operating around the clock, quality maintaining despite the speed. The Hellcat didn't just win battles, it revolutionized naval warfare. Pre-war doctrine assumed carriers were vulnerable platforms that needed to strike first to survive. The Hellcat inverted this completely. Carriers became fortresses that could absorb and repel any air attack. Admiral Mark Mitcher, commander of Task Force 58, understood this transformation. With the Hellcat, he said, "We don't need to find them first. Let them come. The F6F will destroy them at our convenience." This confidence allowed unprecedented offensive operations. American carriers could park off enemy coastlines for weeks. Their Hellcat umbrellas made them essentially invulnerable to air attack. Beyond technology, the Hellcat represented a cultural philosophy that invalidated Japanese military doctrine. The samurai tradition emphasized individual excellence, spiritual strength, and acceptance of death. The Hellcat embodied systematic efficiency, material superiority, and preservation of life. This philosophical gulf meant Japanese pilots couldn't adapt to Hellcat tactics, even when they understood them. The concept of refusing combat when disadvantaged, which was fundamental to Hellcat doctrine, was literally unthinkable to Japanese pilots trained in Bushido. In 1962, the United States Navy held a symposium on Pacific War aviation. American and Japanese veterans gathered to discuss the conflict with historical perspective. Captain David McCampbell, the Navy's ace of aces with 34 victories, stated simply, "The Hellcat won the Pacific Air War, period. It destroyed Japanese aviation and made our victory inevitable." Commander Saburo Sakai responded, "The Zero was a superior fighter," he said. "The Hellcat was a superior weapon system. We never understood the difference until too late. We brought swords to a gunfight and wondered why we lost. The Hellcat's dominance can be reduced to simple mathematics that tell a profound story. Kill ratio 19-1 overall, 13-1 specifically against Zeros. Hellcats produced 12,275 in 30 months. Zeros produced from 1943 to 1945, approximately 6,000. American pilots trained on Hellcats, over 5,000. Japanese pilots remaining by August 1945. Fewer than 100 combat-capable. Admiral Saburo Ozawa, who had commanded the Japanese fleet at Philippine Sea, provided perhaps the most honest assessment. "We laughed at the Hellcat," he said, because we didn't understand it represented not just an aircraft, but an entire civilization's approach to war. By the time we stopped laughing, our air forces had ceased to exist. Lieutenant Commander Saburo Sakai lived until the year 2000. In his final interview, he was asked about the Hellcat. His response captured the totality of its dominance. "The Zero made Japan a great naval power," he said. "The Hellcat made Japan realize it was never as great as it believed. We thought we were samurai. The Hellcat showed us we were just men with outdated weapons facing the future." Every Japanese pilot who survived the war survived because a Hellcat pilot chose to let them live. That is the ultimate defeat, existing at your enemy's discretion. The F6F Hellcat entered service weighing twice what the Zero weighed, carrying armor the Zero didn't have, powered by an engine the Japanese couldn't build, armed with weapons they couldn't match, guided by radars they couldn't detect, flown by pilots they couldn't equal in training, and produced in numbers they couldn't comprehend. Japanese pilots had laughed at it because they didn't understand that every extra pound represented not weakness, but the strength of an industrial democracy that could afford to protect its warriors. By the time they understood, their laughter had turned to last letters home, their mockery to kamikaze missions, their confidence to complete collapse. The Hellcat hadn't just defeated the Zero, it had destroyed an entire philosophy of warfare, proving that in modern combat, the nation that could build the better system would destroy the nation that could only build better warriors. The Japanese pilots had laughed at the F6F Hellcat. The Hellcat had the last laugh. It always did.